Hello. We are now on to the second part of my talk, What is Consciousness? To start out, I want to look at some of the responses to the talk on a Facebook forum called Consciousness Studies. I posted the talk there because it seemed like an appropriate place to post the talk to see what people thought. The response was kind of surprising. We'll take a look. So I'm logged on to Consciousness Studies and we'll look at some of the responses. So here's a incredibly astute, reasoned response. What about an electronic shamanistic explanation? This is in response to the fact that the subtitle to my talk, What is Consciousness, is called A Quantum Buddhist Explanation. So here we have somebody who is attempting basically to pour scorn on the idea that there's any connection between quantum physics and Buddhist philosophy by making a joke. Nothing beyond that. What about an electronic shamanistic explanation? And someone else wades in. Oh, perhaps an EMF anarchist explanation. He wants to join in the fun, wants to give his ego an airing, seeing the other person get, they're like piranha. They kind of get their teeth in as soon as possible. Oh, my ego hasn't had a good outing for a few days, and here's somebody claiming something which must be nonsense because Buddhism, quantum, mind you, I know absolutely nothing about it. I do need to have a good outing for an insult today. So here we go. Isn't that funny? Perhaps an EMF anarchist explanation. That will get him. Ha 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 ha. Now, I've been on a few forums. I don't go on them that often, actually. I just kind of thought, since I'm doing YouTube talks and this forum came to my attention, I thought it was worth joining it. But what I have discovered when I have joined forums like this in the past, point is, on all these forums you get these kind of hyena packs or piranha packs of people who are there just basically because they've got a desperate thirst to gnash their ego teeth, anything they think they can get their metaphorical teeth into, to give their ego a good airing, by being silly and offensive, basically. So I wrote back, being silly and offensive about something you know nothing about does not reflect well on a person's character. A reasoned refutation is always more civilized. It may surprise you to know that several quantum physicists, David Bohm, Basil Heide, David Peat, actually I think David Peat was a philosopher, Bernard Despinay, he was a definite quantum physicist, Vlatko Vidro, physicist, Michael Mensky, brilliant Russian physicist, Victor Mansfield, physicist and a Buddhist, have all noted this connection between insights of Buddhist metaphysics and quantum discoveries. And I then give a link to the very significant physicist Anton Zeilinger with the Dalai Lama. And the link is there. So when I'm on these forums, I always try, if I make an assertion, I try and back it up with facts, reason. And on my website I've got lots of articles I've written, and I've just started doing these YouTube videos, and I always give as much reasoning as I possibly can, whereas these people, they don't. They just throw insults around. And then they don't, when you say, well, can you actually back it up with some reasoning? You never get any reasoning. You know, what you get back is something like, thank you. I did greatly enjoy His Holiness accidentally bashing his microphones while elucidating the relationship between observer and observe it. Delightful. So again, you see, this man thinks he's being very, very clever, very profound, by basically being offensively stupid. Now you may think, well, Graham, you're being offensively stupid. You're taking a piss out of these people. Yes, I am, but I'm doing it in response to the unprovoked, offensive, despicable behaviour of the people on the forum. Now, someone on this forum said, oh my God, you know, you're accusing all these people of being offensive, using all this bad language, but look at you, you're saying they've only got 2 brain cells, and you're saying they couldn't rub 2 bits of logic together if it hit them in the face, you know, you're being offensive. And I said, well, yeah, but look, figure out, go back to discussion and see who started the offensive slanging match, me or these other people. And it's always the other people. I pointed out to them, if somebody actually comes up and says something rational and says, well, I think you're wrong because, I'll look at the evidence presented and the reasoning presented and give a reasoned response. I respond in kind. And I see nothing wrong with that. So if we move on, here we go. This is a guy, I shall call him Fred Crowbar. Consciousness is just fairy tarts, silly man. You see, I mean, that's so, you've got to admire the depth of reasoning of these people. It's spectacular, isn't it? I mean, God, what intellect. Melts my heart. But you get a lot of this on these kind of sites, and it becomes quickly obvious that the people know nothing about what they're talking about. If you say, well, quantum physics, you know, does have a relationship between Madhyamaka and Yogacara, because there are claims that Madhyamaka says the world of physicality is ultimately empty of inherent existence, and certainly this is what quantum theory claims, because the quantum field is basically immaterial, for example. And this is just one example. Yogacara metaphysics says that the ultimate nature of reality is consciousness-like, and there are quantum physicists, highly qualified quantum physicists, but these people don't care, of course, about the fact that Henry Stapp discussed these things with Heisenberg, and John Wheeler, and all these people are highly respected quantum physicists. No, they know, you know, because, well, they're materialists. You know, but when it comes to philosophy, the materialist position is completely watertight, and materialists are the most cosmically wonderful intellects in the whole universe. So wonderful that they can insult people without evidence, reasoning. I've said they know nothing, pretty much, in terms of, you know, knowing about quantum theory and Buddhist philosophy. They will know nothing. They won't know what Madhyamaka is, they won't know what Dzogchen is, they won't know what Yogacara is. I doubt they know the name of one Buddhist philosopher, they won't know who Nagarjuna is, Chandrakirti, Shantideva, you know, they will know none of this. And you can see they know nothing, because they will throw at you things like, well, stop appealing to authorities. Well, you see, if you say, well, Henry Stapp has this point of view, and you explain the point of view, and you explain why you think the point of view is correct, you're not actually using the logical fallacy of appealing to an authority, because what you're doing is citing a respectable source of knowledge in the field. The logical fallacy of appealing to authority is appealing to somebody you think is an authority, but you don't actually know what they're actually saying. You just assume they're an authority and throw their name in, even though you know nothing about them. That is the logical fallacy of appealing to an authority. If you go and look at any academic paper, you will see that it's quite well respected, and it is the mode of discourse within academia to quote other people and to demonstrate you know what these people are saying and you know why they're saying it. That is not appealing to an authority. It's not the logical fallacy of appealing to authority. But these people won't know this. Oh yes, I was also accused of using ad hominem arguments in my discussion in the consciousness, what is consciousness talk, but it's just not true. An ad hominem argument is if I was to say, well, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about because he's got odd socks on, or he's got smelly feet, or he doesn't brush his hair, or he squints a lot, or his nose is runny. Something like that, I don't like him, whatever. That may be an ad hominem argument. Explaining what somebody actually says and showing that it's logically incoherent by explaining the logical contradictions in a person's point of view, and then saying that this was fraudulent because you showed that in fact the person itself should have known at the time, as I do, AJAS 17 years later, quite clearly states that it was all anyway, but he and Brian McGee have a good laugh about it. He knew he was grifting at the time. According to another commentator who's made more of an attempt, he actually listened to some of my talk, said I couldn't really spend 2+ hours listening to the slow droning with huge gaps of silence. Well, some people actually liked it, but there you go. I find that a lot of YouTubers spout on at such a rate you don't have time to think. But that's just my feeling about the issues. I tend to think about what I'm saying, but some people don't like you thinking, just like you to spout stuff out. So anyway, he skipped about. And then it didn't take him long to find some misrepresentations, fallacies, he claims. Matter is not defined as something without the capacity for consciousness by materialists, which is something I claim. So according to this man, my claim that matter is defined as something which doesn't have the capacity for consciousness by materialists is false. Well, here I have a definition of matter from the Free Dictionary. And it says, and in a whole list of definitions, the one which relates to physics pretty much is substance occupies space and has mass as distinguished from substance that is mental, spiritual, and so on. Well, seems to me that that definition certainly does exclude the capacity for consciousness, because it says it excludes, what's the word it uses, distinguished from, i.e. set apart from consciousness and so forth. Now, of course, this is the Cartesian view of matter, and this is the Cartesian view is basically the one which most people have at the back of their mind, even physicists, when they're talking about matter. In philosophical mode, of course. Now, when they're doing real physics, they'll be just manipulating equations, of course, and they will be using far more, how can we say, immaterial concepts, mathematics and stuff like that. But in general, if you're a materialist, as these people claim they are, then you think that matter is fundamental. And matter is defined within the Cartesian worldview. And unless you actually specify quite clearly you have a different conception of matter and you define it, then most people will assume you're using a Cartesian conception of matter. My claim that matter is defined as something without the capacity of consciousness is quite correct, not a fallacy or misrepresentation. Now, this is not to say that every definition of matter will say as distinct from consciousness. No, that is implied. If you implied matter is solid stuff making up the external world, let's say, that is distinct from consciousness because we live in a world where the Cartesian concepts are fundamental, unless you give a more rigorous definition for your own purposes, which these people never do. They say, well, we're materialists, so the world is material, of course. And then they say, oh, no, you're misdefining matter. No, here I'm not. And one of the astonishing things about this debate, let's call it that, it's more like a slanging match anyway, not from my side, of course, the debate is that it illustrates quite clearly that my claim that materialists are basically philosophical frauds is absolutely correct. Why? Because when you go on these forums and say, well, of course, consciousness in some sense is actually in the ground of reality, they say, oh, no, oh my, no. Consciousness is just fairy farts, silly man, as Fred Jawbridge or Crowbar or says about my views. They come back at you if they try to give you any kind of coherent explanation at all, rather than just kind of insulting you. But then if you say, oh right, okay, I get it, so matter's defined as not having any kind of inherent qualities of consciousness, is that correct? No, matter can give rise to consciousness. Well, hang on, you just said that matter has nothing to do with consciousness, and now you're saying that matter does have the capacity to become conscious. Is that right? You're saying one thing here, but now because you don't like the implications, you're now saying something else. This is exactly what's going on. It is philosophical smoke and mirrors, sleight of mind, sleight of intellectual hand, deception, whatever you want to call it. It's still logical incoherence. Another feature of this debate, let's call it that, which I find utterly exasperating, is the extraordinary arrogance of some of the people, the materialists, who are involved in it, who seem to think that they can dismiss other people's views on a whim as being opinions, but then when they offer their own opinions, these opinions somehow become facts, even though they're clearly opinions. So this guy, Fred Underpass, we'll call him this time, says, when I give a link to Henry Stapp's opinion. Now remember, Henry Stapp is, well, let's see what Henry Stapp's credentials are. And let me reiterate, this is not me appealing to authority in the sense of performing a logical fallacy or engaging in some kind of fraudulent intellectual activity. It is standard practice within academia to actually cite authorities in the field if they are authorities in the field and if you understand what their claims are and what the basis for the claims are. And I've studied Stapp in great detail and have written about him in great detail in relation to other physicists such as Michael Minsky and Amit Goswami. So this doesn't mean one has to take what Stapp says purely because he says it. One looks into whether the evidence he presents stacks up or not. But to say his opinion has absolutely no validity, as we will see, Fred Underpass does, then, a few comments later, presents his own opinions, which are worth, well, he seems to think they're cosmically validated, whereas Stapp's are worthless, of course, according to, oh God. Anyway, Henry Stapp. In 1958, Stapp was invited by Wolfgang Pauli to ETH Zurich to work with him personally on basic problems in quantum mechanics. In 1969, Stapp was invited by Werner Heisenberg to work with him at Max Planck Institute in Munich. In 1976, Stapp was invited by John Wheeler to work with him on problems in the foundations of quantum mechanics. Dr. Stapp has published many papers pertaining to the non-local aspects of quantum mechanics and Bell's theorem. Stapp has worked also in a number of conventional areas of high-energy physics, including the analysis of the scattering of polarized protons, parity violation, and S-matrix theory. Now in this discussion he's talking about the Planck level. So he's saying the Planck scale of things to be the smallest possible, so I take it the quantum events occur at any scale up to the level of atoms. Then he goes on about coordinated interactions of millions of neurons. Now, the point of all this is it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant, and I'll go into this in a moment in more detail, because the description he's talking to here of atoms and the so-called subatomic particles beneath atoms and Planck scale events, from the point of view of quantum field theory, which is the deepest, most, if you like, the foundational level of quantum theory, all these events emerge from perturbations of the quantum field. During this series of exchanges, one of the participants uses the term wily and silly with reference to my quantum Buddhist perspective. It's interesting. Why would you use the term wily? These people, it seems that one gets the impression that somehow these people think they're being challenged by some kind of vampiric evil spirit of some kind, which they have to protect themselves with illogical materialist professions of belief. It's almost as if, the consciousness, anyone who thinks in terms of consciousness being a real aspect of the universe is like Nosferatu, the vampire, who's, after sucking their blood or something. This must be the reason for the hostility, the offensive jokiness. It's fear.
The knife is old and could be dirty. It could give you blood poisoning. Please, let me do it. It's the oldest remedy in the world.
Oh, forget it. It's hardly worth mentioning. Just a little cut.
I must confess that I'm getting a bit silly myself at this point, but it's the only way I can defend myself from this utter ridiculous behaviour. In a moment we will look at what some physicists have to say about the nature of matter and whether it exists or not in the way that classical pre-quantum physics thought it did, and what its nature is now that the quantum revolution has taken place, and whether in fact the ultimate foundation for all phenomena is the quantum field rather than material bits and pieces, And there are quite a few books we can have a look at for this, on the matter of matter, so to speak. We've got Brian Greene, Until the End of Time. Jim Baggott, Math. The Janus Point. That's Julian Barber. These are physicists. Robert Erter, Theory of Almost Everything. Lee Smolin, Einstein's Unfinished Revolution. There I got the quantum revolution here. Quantum strangeness. These are just a few. Here we have a huge book. Roger Penrose. I think he was knighted for contributions to physics. Does his opinions matter? Fred Overpass at all? Something Deeply Hidden by Sean Carroll. But I disagree with Sean Carroll's philosophical viewpoint. He's obviously a pretty good quantum physicist, otherwise he wouldn't be in the position he's in, but that means he's a brilliant mathematician. doesn't make him a good philosopher at all. But you have to read with attention and philosophical insight the works of people you disagree with. And it's always better to refrain from silly jokes and just say, well, this is why they're wrong, because there's a logical incoherence in these statements. Now, when I was showing you the books we might want to take a look at to resolve some issues concerning the ultimate nature of reality, or the ultimate nature of matter, if it turns out to exist, as an ultimate aspect of the universe, that is. One of the books I showed was Roger Penrose, Road to Reality, and I wondered whether Bill Crowbar would allow Roger Penrose's opinion, because he seems to discount opinions willy-nilly kind of thing. You know, opinions don't matter, we need facts. But whose facts exactly? Because as we shall see in a moment, Bill Crowbar has an awful lot of opinions. For example, there's no irrational quantum mechanics. There are just paradoxes we don't understand. That's a problem with our understanding. We will know what explains it when we understand it, and vice versa. I think that is an opinion, don't you know? There's nothing plausible about quantum consciousness. Quantum consciousness theories. They're complete fantasy. You know, they're fairy farts, I think he said. That's the one, fairy farts. Without the slightest connection between consciousness and quantum events. Again, I'm pretty sure that is an opinion. You know, I'll just look up what an opinion is, just in case he knows more than I do. You know, I've used the word for quite a long time. I'm 70 now, so probably about 60 years maybe, but maybe I don't know what it is. Let's have a look. An opinion is a view or judgment formed about something, not necessarily based on fact or knowledge. So, I mean, basically this tells you opinions are views formed about various subjects, and they may be opinions based on knowledge or not on knowledge. So they may be opinions which are supported, or there may be opinions unsupported. Therefore, yeah, Bill Crowbar is definitely offering opinions. But as we've seen, he told us earlier, opinions are, well, I guess using his terminology, opinions are fairy farts as well. Whatever, they don't count for anything. We need facts. Whose facts? Well, it turns out that Bill Crowbar thinks that his opinions are facts, and the people whose opinions he likes are facts. Here we go. There's an upstart on here, not me, someone else, who thinks that consciousness might be involved. This guy's called Philippe Just View, as in, you know, sort of justice view. He says, except the double-slit experiment, which shows invariably that the act of observation influences what is ultimately observed. And justice view is addressing Bill Crowbar, he goes on and he says, but given your materialist fanaticism, I do suspect that the facts will not have any significance for you. So yeah, I mean, the apparent observer effect, I use apparent because basically, one looks at the evidence, which is a double-slit experiment in which when which path knowledge is available, i.e. which slit the quantum wave particle goes through, then it goes through as a particle. When you don't determine the path that it takes, so it goes through both slits, it travels as a wave. So one's which path knowledge clearly influences what's going on at the quantum level. It's not, these are facts. The experimental facts of the double slit experiment have been repeated over and over again. And the natural observation, when you don't come to the interpretation with a desperation to hold to a materialist position, is that consciousness is involved in some way. When Bill Crowbar makes the comment that evidence rules, Justice View comes back and says, I find it hilarious that you claim that evidence rules, whilst adhering to the materialist position. Quantum mechanics has already ruled out the materialist position, although clearly word hasn't gotten to you yet. And then he quotes Bernard Despenay, the doctrine that the world is made up of objects whose existence is independent of human consciousness turns out to be in conflict with quantum mechanics and with facts established by experiment, remarked the French theoretical physicist Bernard Despenay. To which Bill Crowbar says, quoting people is not evidence. Well, actually quoting people who are leading exponents of the field, whilst understanding the evidence, the understanding being that the double slit experiment with all its permutations has been done in various combinations. I mean, John Wheeler actually came up with a delayed choice version in which the decision as to wave or particle is made by a decision whether to gather which way information is made after the wave particle has gone past the slits, which seems to imply that consciousness acts backwards in time. And indeed, John Wheeler did say that consciousness acts backwards in time, as we'll see in a moment. But anyway, as I say, quoting people who are experts in the field, whilst knowing why they make the assertions they do, is pretty acceptable within academic life. I mean, as I've pointed out, quoting people you know nothing about, hoping that no one will notice you know nothing about them, that's a different matter. If you've examined the evidence for yourself, and I assume that Justice View has, but I certainly have, because I've written 7 books on the subject and examined the evidence in great detail, then it is very relevant to point out some hugely intelligent people who are leaders in the field of quantum theory have come to this conclusion. Well, it kind of counts evidence, really. But as we've seen, Bill Crowbar only thinks that people he agrees with are worth counting as evidence. People he doesn't agree with, well, they've just got unsupported opinions, even if they're widely respected quantum physicists. And in fact, just a few comments back, Bill Crowbar, wait for it, again, for everyone, be told, quantum observation has nothing to do with consciousness. That does sound like an opinion to me, Bill. Anyway, so, and he gives a link. So obviously he does think that some people's opinions do matter. And the link is to Wikipedia, which has, guess what, some opinions. And of course they're both opinions by physicists, and they are widely respected physicists. And one of the opinions, facts. It's Tim Crowbar has pointed these out, so they must be facts, not opinions. I'm getting mixed up in a moment. As John Bell, now John Bell is a very important physicist indeed, very important physicist. And I know this, it's a good joke. Was the wave function waiting to jump for thousands of millions of years until a single-celled living creature appeared? Or did it have to wait a little longer for some highly qualified measurer with a PhD? And I've actually always liked that joke. John Bell came up with a couple of very good jokes. Einstein came up with a good joke. He said he didn't believe his bed spread out all over his room when he left it and jumped back into the corner when he came back. So yeah, there were some good jokes, but I mean, Einstein's joke didn't actually apply because the joke is aimed at the classical level. But as to John Bell's joke, the issue is, does Tim Overground actually understand where this joke comes from? And it comes basically from Wheeler's view that he put this forward is in this book, Guion's Black Holes and Quantum Foam, which is the biography stroke autobiography. It's Wheeler in collaboration with Kenneth Ford, and Wheeler puts forward the view that the universe is a self-synthesized circuit, which he gives this picture for. And this is the view basically that the universe chugs along completely at the quantum level, and at some point some kind of observing consciousness observes backwards in time the universe and then creates the universe backwards in time. And this is what John Bell was joking about. He just thought it was ludicrous, and I don't accept this view either. Although the view is promoted actually in Hawking and Mlodino's book, recent book, The Grand Design. Do you believe me? Wait. So here's Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodino's book, The Grand Design, written quite a bit after John Wheeler, I think 20 years or so. And they're talking about, this is a chapter called Choosing Our Universe. Choosing. They use the word choosing our universe, just in case. Choosing our universe. Now, does choosing involve consciousness? Yeah. Yes, of course it does. In this view, the universe appeared spontaneously, starting off in every possible way. Most of these correspond to other universes, some of which are similar to ours, most are very different. Some people make a great mystery of this, but these are just different expressions of definement, some over histories, that's a quantum presentation. But the point is basically saying that the universe starts out, as Wheeler says, as a vast pool, so to speak, of quantum potentialities, we're saying. We are the product of quantum fluctuations in the early universe. One should trace the histories from top down, backwards from the present time. The histories that contribute to definement, some don't have an independent existence but depend on what is being measured. We create history by our observations rather than history creating us, i.e. backwards in time. So, of course, Mlodinow and Hawking to a large degree went on to pretend they never said this because it's not consistent with the overwhelming materialist view. And as we shall see in a moment, there's a kind of hidden agenda which is policed by anti-quantum mysticism, thought police. As the physicists Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner wrote in their book Quantum Enigma how physics encounters consciousness, or physics is an encounter with consciousness. They tell us that there was a kind of pressure within physics departments not to get involved in metaphysical speculation, especially not speculation involving consciousness. I mean, they write, in physics departments, a conforming mindset increasingly meant that an untenured faculty member might endanger a career by serious interest in the fundamentals of quantum physics. Even today, it is best to explore the meaning of quantum mechanics while also working a day job on a mainstream physics topic. This is also indicated by the quite famous term shut up and calculate, which was a kind of implicit, sometimes explicit command to students at universities involved in the exploration of quantum theory, probably up until very recent times. Don't get involved with speculations about what's really going on. Just bother with equations and calculations. According to an online article written by David Mermin, the term or the phrase "shut up and calculate" may have been a motto or saying of the famous physicist Richard Feynman. There are a few people who suggest that Feynman was the source of this phrase. When asked which interpretation of quantum mechanics he favoured, Feynman said, "Shut up and calculate." So even if you come up with some kind of mystical view, quantum mystical view, you're likely to get, a late night knock at the door by the academic thought police to put your thinking right. Which is why even Wheeler, for some of the time, would say idiotic things like, well, in fact, the observation could be done by a piece of mica. Stones making observations backwards in time, but towards the end of his life, he completely made it clear what his view was, that observations by consciousness backwards in time create reality. And this is...
It's possible to choose which, after the particle has already made its travel. You choose after the particle has decided whether it's going both routes or one route. And after it's got through, you yourself decide which it shall have done. You seem to intervene to change the past. But quantum theory says it can be done, and I had the pleasure to spell out some of the features of such an experimental arrangement.
And this is the view that John Bell was lampooning in this: was the wave function waiting to jump for thousands of years for a single-celled organism, or did it require a PhD? And of course Bill Crowbar would love this because it's a joke which has no evidential backing, despite the fact that he's saying all over the place here that it's only evidence that counts. So jokes, if they're materialist jokes, they don't need evidence, Just give a good laugh and think that people who have different views are silly, They believe in fairy farts. But anyway, if we look at John Bell, now, did John Bell have any evidence? Has Bill Crowbar actually looked into whether John Bell has any evidence, hardcore materialist evidence? Well, here we have a book by Andrew Whittaker. Andrew Whittaker is Professor of Physics at Queen's University, Belfast, so I guess, he should know what he's talking about. We should be able to have some credence. It's worth looking at what he says. What's he say about John Bell? John Bell remained all his life a realist. Excuse me. He considered himself to be a follower of Einstein in these matters. And John Bell supported Bohm's pilot wave theory, which had guiding waves prodding bits of matter all over the place. But Bohm realised his pilot wave. But there are too many problems. Contextuality was a big one. Classical level non-locality. I wonder if Bill Crowbar knows about this or not. And John Bell himself indicated that his desire for a realistic world was just that, a desire, a preference on his part. It was not a decision on his part prompted by clear experimental evidence. It was the way he wanted the world to be, even if the evidence was contrary to his desire. He writes, "One wants to be able to take a realistic view of the world, to talk about the world as if it were really there. even when it is not being observed. I certainly believe in a world that was here before me and will be there after me. And I believe you are part of it. And I believe that most physicists take this point of view when they are being pushed into corners by philosophers. Jean Bricmont is a physicist who has written a couple of books criticizing the view that consciousness is an important aspect of quantum functioning, and this one is quantum sense and nonsense. Again, I show these books because I'm trying to point out, if one wants to make comments on this kind of stuff, you really do need to do a bit of research. I mean, although Bricmont is thoroughly materialistic in his approach, I would still research his books. I love doing this because I want to know exactly what he thinks and why he thinks what he thinks. And the actual research is fascinating. And he writes about John Bell and David Bohm, who in the early days was a materialist but became a full supporter of a kind of quantum mysticism in his later life. But anyway, Bricmont talks about John Bell, and he says, after World War II, the critique of the mainstream view, that's the Copenhagen mystical view, was taken up in the main part by the American physicist David Bohm and the Irish physicist John Bell. The latter was once interviewed by people who recalled that we first asked Bell over the telephone whether he himself felt he had demonstrated that reality doesn't exist. He responded by warning us that he is an impatient, irascible sort who tolerates no nonsense. But this does not alter the fact that John Bell actually did not have any experimental evidence to prove his ingrained desire to live in a real world. And by real, what was meant was completely independent of consciousness. This is the point. That's what the term real means in this connection. You really do need to know this stuff when you do analysis. But I mean, the point is that if you know about John Bell, he had a predilection, a preference, a prejudgment, if you like, for realism. He never proved anything. If anything, John Bell produced the Bell inequalities, which were used by John Clauser and others to prove quantum non-locality. So in fact, John Bell, who was a realist, actually produced equations which were absolutely instrumental in proving that the world was, well, the quantum world was thoroughly unreal because it was non-local. You couldn't make this stuff up. Now in another section just above in the comments, Bill Crowbar actually says something I agree with, and he talks about people like Deepak Chopra, and he says that the idea that consciousness creates reality and so forth is the domain of con men and quacks spreading falsehoods for financial gain, quantum woo-woo is a large industry. Now, there is a degree of truth in this.
Now, see, now this is amazing, because if you can do with this with a string,
Right.
it means you can do it with your life.
Yeah, you can do it with anything. You can fulfill any desire in life that you want, because inherent in having the desire is the mechanics for its fulfillment. I don't have the same desires as you because nature gave me those. That science is now in a process of overthrowing the climactic overthrow of the superstition of materialism. That everything that we call matter comes from something that is not material. That the essential nature of the physical world is that it's not physical. That the essential stuff of the universe is non-stuff. That there are gaps between every two ons where you find a field of possibilities, a field of pure potentiality. Science doesn't call it God, but what is God if not the immeasurable potential of all that was, all that is, and all that will be? Science also tells us that this is a field of non-locality, where everything is correlated with everything else, that there's hidden creativity, there are quantum leaps of creativity, that there's something called the observer effect, where intention orchestrates space-time events, which we then measure as movement and motion and energy.
You asked, Dan, what I meant by woo-woo. That is the very embodiment of woo-woo.
And my own feeling is that people like Deepak Chopra and many others like Gene Houston. There's another guy called Paul Levy who's actually plagiarized my work. I should do So here is Paul Levy's book, The Quantum Revelation. And Paul Levy read my first book, Quantum Buddhism, and he got in touch with me and said what a fantastic book it was, wanted to know which other books of mine he should read, and he left an Amazon review saying Quantum Buddhism was one of the best books he's ever read. And then he set out to replicate it, pretty much. When I say replicates it, he replicates it in a thoroughly New Agey, dumbed down fashion. Shows he doesn't really understand. But he knows how to get the attention of the New Age community. In the sections where he takes, paragraph by paragraph, my own work, when he actually writes his own bits between my paragraphs, he shows he doesn't understand what he's actually plagiarizing. I'm writing a book at the moment, actually tearing this to pieces. He doesn't understand Wojciech Zurek at all. He claims that Wojciech Zurek is a fully fledged quantum mystic, and is not. Wojciech Zurek put forward the idea of quantum Darwinism, trying to do the exact opposite to what Levy claims. But all these New Age grifters don't seem to, or even Dean Radin. Well, Dean Radin, big name. You'd expect better from him. Doesn't seem to realise that this guy is just a grifter. And I'm using these very damning terms because I know this is lifted from me. Well, the idea is lifted from me, but the actual way it's carried out is appalling. He claims that and what he's done basically, he's lifted ideas from me, and he's taken ideas which are mine and just put them in here as if they were his. He's taken paragraphs from me. But what he's done is actually he's undermined what I've been trying to do, because he's actually projected into a fully fluffified, mystified, vaguified, New Age bullshit perspective. That's what he's done. you know. Morris claims that, you know, the quantum suddenly had decided to awaken from its slumber to inform the community, the world community, of its existence, to inform us of the spiritual nature of the universe, and somehow the quantum had arisen as if it were, you know, some kind of spiritual entity itself. And at this point in time, the quantum had decided it was time to reveal itself. Hence, he says stuff such as, you know, here he claims that quantum physics is a spiritual treasure. I'm going to release in the new year Quantum Revelations of the Real and the Unreal, in which I take on the New Age grifting community, the way that what Paul Levy does, he hyperinflates claims to the point of absurdity to give his readers a kind of injection after injection of New Age woo-woo frisson of the world is just dreamlike, walk through walls, beam intentionality around the place, get what you want. I mean, anyway, that's what he does. And as I say, you know, Gene Houston, Sting, great bass player and songwriter, great songwriter. The quantum revelation is mind-blowing. And then we got, you know, Gene Houston, Caroline Myss, another New Age grifter, New Age quantum grifter. Even Menace Capitus. Have they read this book and the mistakes in it? And yeah, I imagine Paul Levy's dining out nicely on this, you know. So I look at one of the other pieces of nonsense and laughable nonsense that the double slit experiment gave an incarnate birth to the field of quantum physics. I mean, this is just overinflated writing for ego promotion. The guy thinks he's a prophet. I mean, I'm getting, you know, obviously. Quantum mechanics was like a Kabbalistic secret that God revealed to Bohr. Now, this is a quote that he just nicked from somebody, not realizing it's a joke. He's actually taken the quote, which is actually a joke, at Bohr's expense, but he's written it as if it is meant seriously. This is a prime example of New Age, quantum New Age grifting. Like a precious treasure thirsting to be brought forth, the mysterious place where the quantum abides, waiting to be discovered. You see, really, it's kind of inner pressure of the quantum trying to open our minds from within. And Levy is the prophet, come to awaken us to the quantum dream. Anyway, so you can see why some people get really, really irritated with this kind of grifting nonsense for ego gratification and profit. Indeed.
Of us observing this universe is creative. That we're not that the act of observation is, you know, just opens up everything about what I'm really interested in, because that idea that the act of observing the universe actually affects the universe, that's exactly like a dream, because quantum physics is empirically proving, and maybe a lot of physicists, you know, I'm not a physicist, but I'm just a curious person, and I know about, I connect with my dreams, and was having this experience of the dreamlike nature of this reality, and I was realizing, oh my God, quantum physics is describing the dreamlike nature of reality. Quantum physics, it has empirically proven beyond the slightest shadow of a doubt that we are having a collectively shared dream. And that's mind-blowing, because it's basically saying that the act of observing each and every moment, the act of us observing this universe is creative, that we're not that the act of observation is not just a passive act, but we're actually creating moment by moment our experience of ourselves and our experience of the world. And that's like pointing at, the incredible, and it's sort of, to the majority of us, it's untapped creative power. We carry this unbelievable creative potency, and because we're unconscious of it, we're implementing it unconsciously, to the most part, in a way that's destroying us, and that's being writ large.
And because they, how can I put it, over mystify. They are vague and woolly. They do not go into the details in any great detail, and they do make overinflated claims. They actually are counterproductive. But then even when I've held this view and I've suggested, for example, there's this terrible film called What the Bleep, produced by Amit Goswami, absolutely terrible film. I mean, it's the most infantile thing I'd ever seen. And it's about quantum theory, and I thought these films like this are just counterproductive. They make the whole terrain seem infantile. But I've met somebody who said, well, without this film, they would have known nothing about this area of discourse. But I still tend to think it's better to have carefully reasoned presentations, not overinflated, because then you get people like Bill Crowbar coming back and saying, well, this is all quantum woo-woo. And if you look at some of the YouTube presentations by people like Deepak Chopra, they do look quite questionable from somebody who wants more precision. But they're not completely false either. An example of what I would call overinflated claims would be books like this one by Deepak Chopra with Menas Kafatos, You Are the Universe. Ooh, weird, mysterious. And you can see where Bill Crowbar's coming from. Are we the universe? Well, in one sense we are, but it needs a lot more explanation than this, and you don't really get this stuff is too fluffy, too over the top, too new age. And it would seem as if You Are the Universe was modelled on this translation of Long Chenpa, who was a Dzogchen practitioner. You are the eyes of the world. And in a sense, a very similar message. Long Chenpa, 14th century, pure and total presence, and the real heart of all spiritual pursuits. The three approaches with their three teachers do not exist apart from this one definitive approach. This is the level of the creative energy of the universe, pure and total presence. It is the source of all spiritual pursuits. Listen, I am the teacher, universal creativity. And this is a text about how deep beneath the levels of manifestation lies a source of pure presence, pure awareness, which can be contacted through deep meditative practices. The difference between these two books is, however, that this book seems to give the impression that reading a few New Age books would do the trick. Whereas if you go to Dzogchen and Nyingma texts, it's kind of implied that a lot more meditative effort is involved in reaching deep levels of direct experience of non-dual levels of mind. You know, I mean, great Buddhist adepts retreated to caves for years at a time to achieve enlightenment. They didn't read a few New Age books with their coffee or their chocolate before going to bed. The reason that it's overinflated is that it seems to suggest, as some modern idealists like Bernardo Kastrup seems to suggest, that the entire world is made up of kind of floaty thoughtiness, just like the kind of things which are wandering around in our minds. The kind of idealism in the West kind of implies that, you know, everything around me is no more than thoughts in my mind being projected outwards, but that's not my position at all. It's not the position of Dzogchen Buddhism. Yogacara, well, Yogacara consciousness only Buddhism, you really have to interpret this. You need to know a lot about the claims. Works by the brilliant Buddhist philosopher, Dzogchen philosopher, Rongzon Chokdi Zangpo, and he tells us, as Dzogchen tells us, the world is illusion-like, but there are degrees of illusion. This is the important point. So when you read books, some New Age books, you get the impression that if you read enough of them, you'll be able to walk through walls. I mean, I'm not joking. I mean, there is as Paul Levy guy says, basically, that we are beams of intentionality. You know, we're creating the world moment by moment with our conscious thoughts. And it's this kind of stuff which Deepak Chopra gives you this kind of idea as well. And it's this kind of stuff which I know drives people with a materialist disposition into a frenzy. The claim that consciousness plays a significant role in the creation of reality does not mean that the material world is just floaty idea stuff, non-existent floaty idea stuff, but it's only just existent. It's 99.9999999 empty space. You've got to understand this. It's not there at all. This is why materialism is nonsense. It's not there. It's 99.9999999 empty space. Check it out. What you think is a real world out there. It's mostly empty space. It is more like a hologram, as David Bohm and various other physicists claim. No matter there at all. I mean, the fact that what was once thought to be a material world, if we mean by matter, sort of substantial stuff, solid stuff of some kind, even an atomic view of the world would imply that, there are protons and neutrons, or maybe the protons and neutrons are made up of quarks, but somewhere along the line there's going to be some solid little bits and pieces, however small they may be, tiny, tiny, tiny. There must be some bits of solid stuff which are there all the time, not flashing in and out of existence as momentary appearances of energy, but, real matter. But that's just not the case. The basic ground of reality is a quantum field, an immaterial quantum field. The fact that there's no matter around, if we mean by matter what most people mean by matter, and what was meant by matter up until the early 20th century, which was solid stuff, then there's no matter around anymore. There's just, momentary appearances of matter arising from processes within the quantum field. Which probably explains why, if we look at Brian Greene's book, which is called Until the End of Time, and the subtitle is, I can't remember, Mind, Matter and Our Search for Meaning in an Evolving Universe. So, I mean, the term matter is in the subtitle, but if you go to the index, you will not find the term matter or mass. Why would that be? A term in the subtitle does not appear in the index. That's very weird. Now, the term material is used, but I mean, this is basically yet another piece of obfuscation by a modern physicist. And I haven't got time here to, I will do a video on, techniques, modes and means of obfuscation by modern physicists in philosophical mode. And one of them is to claim you're going to talk about matter when you don't even mention matter at all in the book. But you go around talking about material this, material that, without even explaining what you mean by material. Well, not clearly. And this is what I mean by deception. Basically, when the term matter is used here, it's used with its old Cartesian type implication that rocks are made of matter, chairs and tables are, solid stuff. And of course, the person who buys this book is going to have that implication. He's not, it's smoke and mirrors. I just said that Brian Greene's book, Until the End of Time, contains a significant degree of smoke and mirrors. Now when we come to look at his description of particles of matter, even though matter is not mentioned in the index, as I say, we can find unadulterated deception, conceptual deception. So in this section, which is called the Disintegration of Emptiness, An interesting title, of course, because in Buddhism, the Madhyamaka in particular, emptiness is a technical term for the ultimate nature of the ground of reality, shunyata. And shunyata, or emptiness, is a ground of immaterial potentiality which gives rise to the apparent realms of matter and mind. In itself, it is not material. And as we shall see when we read Brian Greene's account, his emptiness is not material either, so matter is not fundamental, although he doesn't actually draw this conclusion. He's talking about the Higgs field and how Peter Higgs came up with the idea of the Higgs field. Now, the Higgs field is a quantum field which, when it interacts with particles from other fields, produces mass. Particles of matter, but they're not matter, of course, because matter's meant to have mass, but before the Higgs field gets involved, particles don't have mass. Oh, shock, horror. Why is it that if you were to push on fundamental particles, like electrons or quarks, you would feel the particles resisting your effort? This resistance reflects the particle's mass. But the equations seem to tell a different story. According to the math, the particles should be massless, and thus should offer no resistance at all. Needless to say, the mismatch between reality and the mathematics was driving the physicist batty. The reason the math seemed to countenance only massless particles is a touch technical. It comes down to symmetry. We won't bother to go into that, but the point is the mathematics underlying the functioning of quantum fields and the emergence of particles indicate that particles essentially don't have mass, which means, if you're being honest, if you're not being deceptive, they're not matter. Matter has mass by definition and is devoid of consciousness by definition. Hence the puzzle. The analysis revealed that the same mathematical symmetry that ensures healthy equations also requires massless particles. That's where the Higgs field came in. He argued that, intrinsically speaking, particles are massless, just as the pristine symmetric equations required. Particles acquire mass through environmental influence. Higgs envisioned that mass is filled with an invisible substance, now called the Higgs field, and that particles push through the field, experiencing a drag force. So basically, particles are basically massless. They get mass when they interact with the Higgs field. Therefore, they are not matter if you are using the term matter in a non-deceptive, consistent fashion. When we get to Jim Baggett's book on mass, however, Jim Baggett is has a little more integrity. In the chapter on wave and particle, he tells us mass took another step towards obscurity. The mass of an electron is in part derived from the energy of the virtual photons that dress it. In other words, the material world is an appearance generated by energetic processes within appearances from the quantum field. everything in our tangible reality would appear to be constructed from intangible phantoms. I don't think it's unreasonable to declare that never in the entire history of science has the rug of understanding been pulled so firmly from beneath our feet. In his books, Concepts of Mass in Contemporary Physics and Philosophy, the Israeli physicist and philosopher Max Jammer concluded, in spite of all the strenuous efforts of physicists and philosophers, the notion of mass, although fundamental in physics, is shrouded in mystery. And we go to Robert Urter, Theory of Almost Everything. Electrons are just as ineffable and evanescent as photons. If electrons, then why not protons and neutrons too? Could all matter be described by quantum fields? Was the world of solid objects going to dissolve into an amorphous sea of probabilities and virtual particles? The answer would come with the development of the Standard Model. Matter, the electrons and positrons, and forces, the photons, are both described in the same way by quantum fields. Quantum fields combine particle nature and field nature in a single entity. The quantum field spreads out through space just like a classical field, but it is quantized. When you try to measure the field, you always find a whole particle, or two particles, or none. The new concept, the quantum field, was an attempt to describe a phenomenon so far beyond our experience that analogies to everyday objects simply did not work anymore. I mean, I held up a few books earlier on in this talk, and I was going to go into more detail, but if you read these books, you will find that what was thought to be a material world has dissolved into flashes of momentary existence emerging from an immaterial quantum field of potentiality. There is no physics book written in the last 10 years, I would think, more than that probably, which actually claims that protons, neutrons, quarks, or electrons, any of these supposed entities are little ball bearings on a much, much tinier scale. None. So to go around saying that this is a material world is basically fraudulent. It is extending a term way beyond its appropriate mode of designation, merely as a consequence of a psychological fear of not having a material world. However, when we look at the idea of this 11th century, yes, of course, the 11th century Buddhist philosopher, in the summary, in the introduction, we read, for Rongzong and Buddhist philosophers generally, all phenomena are like an illusion, a mirage. a dream, a reflection. But it does not entail that the psychophysical aggregates constituting a person and, for example, a mirage, are utterly and in all ways the same. According to Rongzong, all ordinary appearances have sources. The force and duration of a given appearance, Rongzong writes, derives from the power of its source. That is, everything is illusory, but some illusions are more powerful and effective over the long term than others. Does this remind you of something Einstein said about a persistent illusion? One moment. Yes, Einstein said reality is an illusion, a very persistent illusion. So Rongzong, 11th century Buddhist philosopher, prefigured Einstein by almost 1,000 years. Because Rongzong basically said that whereas some Buddhists would say that the world is like an illusion, like a mirage, but I mean they're just being imprecise. Rongzong's been far more precise. He's saying basically there are degrees of illusion, and the reality of the material world is not an illusion in the same way as, say, a rainbow is an illusion or a mirage is an illusion. Why? Because the sources from which the material world are generated are far more powerful, far more long-lasting than the source of a short-term illusion such as a rainbow or mirage of water in the distance. This is extraordinary. And when you look into Yogacara, it quite clearly states that the reason why this happens is because, exactly as John Wheeler said, that every perception leaves a trace in the quantum field. It's exactly what Yogacara Buddhism says. Every perception leaves a karmic trace. And when you have millions, billions, billions and billions of trillions of sentient beings leaving traces of quantum potentiality within the quantum field, then the illusion-like nature of the material world is created, but it's not the case that, these sentient beings can walk through walls or anything like that, because the illusion of the material world is far more persistent, far more apparently solid, because it is a collective illusion by vast numbers of sentient beings over vast timescales. This is how reality functions. It's a vast cosmic holographic illusion, exactly as Buddhism has stated, created by an infinitude of perceptions operating through the quantum field, creating the illusion of a solid material world. And although the fact the material world is 99.999999, I think there are 12 or 13 nines after, it's... One Buddhist teacher said the world does exist, but only just. It is a thin veil of appearance. But for the multitude of sentient beings, it functions as if it were real. Now, John Wheeler actually said exactly the same thing. John Wheeler said, directly opposite to the concept of a universe as machine built upon law, is the vision of a world self-synthesized. On this view, the notes struck out on a piano by the observer participants of all times and all places, bits though they are, in and by themselves, constitute the great wide world of space and time and things. And this is a large tome. This is Science and Ultimate Reality. Essays in quantum theory, cosmology and complexity, and these are essays in essays which were, it's a book of essays developed in honour of the 90th birthday of the renowned theoretical physicist John Archibald Wheeler. You know, a whole load of highly qualified physicists came together to contribute essays to this book to celebrate all these pretty respected physicists come to celebrate the work of John Wheeler, and Jim Crowbar thinks that the opinions of John Wheeler have absolutely no validation, no valid basis whatsoever. And it's a fact, of course, so don't bother reading books like this, because Jim Crowbar knows this is just worthless opinion, fairy farts, And what does Anton Zeilinger say? He says, the outstanding feature of Professor Wheeler's viewpoint is his realization that the implications of quantum mechanics are so far-reaching that they require a completely novel approach in our view of reality and in the way that we see our role in the universe. This distinguishes him from many others who, in one way or another, try to save pre-quantum viewpoints, particularly the obviously wrong notion of a reality independent of us. Anton Zeilinger. Very important quantum physics. But, old Crowbar tells us, just ignore it. It's all smoke and mirrors, fairy farts and all this kind of stuff. He knows better than anybody, of course. But, I tend to think Anton Zeilinger's opinion counts for more. Wheeler's viewpoint highlights particularly the obviously wrong notion of a reality independent of us. And, I think, I know my opinion's worthless, but I think that the fact that in the 11th century, Buddhist philosophers came to exactly the same metaphysical viewpoint is absolutely extraordinary. Ronzong was writing in the 11th century, but ideas similar to those ideas, that the whole process of reality consists of levels of illusion-like functioning, were common within other Buddhist traditions such as Dzogchen, which was around over 1,000 years before Ronzong, and Yogacara Vijnanavada, or yogic consciousness only school, which began in about the 4th century. So these kind of ideas were fundamental within both pre-Buddhist and Buddhist thought. For example, Rodney Devenish, who is a Buddhist practitioner and a philosopher, writes of the Yogacara view, Yogacara Vijnanavada, consciousness only. The metaphysical doctrine of the ancient yoga tradition puts forth an understanding of the creation, progression, and eventual destruction of the universe that seems surprisingly modern, to the extent in which it agrees with leading-edge advances in science, quantum mechanics, and cosmology. Those who go deeply into this subject will find this doctrine rooted in a profound understanding of a great mystery called Paramartha, which in Indian philosophy means the absolute. Devoid, it is said, of all attributes, and essentially distinct from manifested finite being. The manifestation and reabsorption of the universe, or domain of finite being, and how the latter relates to the transcendental infinitude of the absolute, has been central to Yogacara inquiry from the beginning of its history. It is believed that by means of proliferation, prapancha, or differentiation, it manifests or is transformed, as it were, into active mentation in the act of creation. This is then explained as the coming into being of Alaya-Vijnana, universal or cosmic consciousness, which is a concept that has also been held in Western philosophy by many great thinkers, from Plato, Plotinus, and others. Now, one way of understanding such views is not to think in terms of Western-style idealism, where the external world is nothing but kind of overlapping thought patterns of the same nature as individual beings have in their minds when they're wandering around doing the shopping. Rather, Paramartha is a deep energy source, a profound energetic sphere of potentiality which has an internal cognizant quality, which in Dzogchen terminology is called luminosity, the capacity for awareness. The luminous nature also has a capacity, or rather the internal cognizant nature has also the capacity to unfold to break into manifestation the potentialities of the basic field, the fundamental field, which is equivalent to a quantum field or a set of quantum fields. So when Devenish talks about these views being entirely consistent with modern quantum theory, he's not making this up. For example, here's a book by David Bohm, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, very important quantum physicist, the quantum physicist who Einstein admired and went to try and get someone to produce a more realistic version of quantum reality, and Bohm produced a pilot wave theory because of his mathematical abilities, which he then developed because of certain problems with the pilot wave theory, and Bohm developed into a much more comprehensive view of what he called the hollow movement. And the hollow movement is a movement of a kind of insubstantial, immaterial field of potentiality which gives rise to the appearances of the material world and embodied subsystems, as he calls them, who have individualized consciousness. But Bohm's quite clear, the nature of consciousness is internal to the fundamental field. David Bohm writes, if matter and consciousness could be understood together in terms of the same general notion of order, the way would be opened to comprehending their relationship on the basis of some common ground. Thus we come to the germ of a new notion of unbroken wholeness, in which consciousness is no longer to be fundamentally separated from matter. And here Bohm is referring to the quantum field as having an internal nature of consciousness. And again, Bohm writes, in Wholeness and the Implicate Order, there is a universal flux that cannot be defined explicitly, but which can be known only implicitly, as indicated by the explicitly indefinable forms and shapes, some stable and some unstable, that can be abstracted from the universal flux. In this flow, mind and matter are not separate substances. Rather, they are different aspects of one whole and unbroken movement. In this way, we're able to look on all aspects of existence as not divided from each other, and thus we can bring to an end the fragmentation implicit in the current attitude towards the atomic point of view. David Bohm's book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, was first published in 1980. And in 2006, this book was published, Unbounded Wholeness, which is a book of translation and commentary on Dzogchen and Bon philosophy. Bon is pre-Buddhist. One can see there's a resonance of titles here, but the resonance goes beyond that, because the echoes, metaphysical echoes, I mean there's no equations here, but the metaphysics that David Bohm developed in his later work is deeply, profoundly resonant of the views expressed in Unbounded Wholeness. It is absolutely extraordinary. What is explicit is that this wholeness, which cannot be totalized or bounded, is thoroughly compatible with diversity. Indeed, diversity, though ordinarily considered the antithesis of unity, is here offered as proof that unbounded wholeness exists. Being so diverse, and constantly changing besides, means that unbounded wholeness admits of no defining characteristic or stable identity. In this sense, it is indefinite and unspeakable. How can indefiniteness be a characteristic of reality? How can one develop authentic trust or confidence in such an unstable reality? Unbounded wholeness is established because there are many diverse perspectives. Unbounded wholeness cannot be decided or defined as any one thing. This claim of holistic diversity is a clarion call to debate. This means basically that the existence of the deep ground of unity, when it breaks into manifestation as diversity, acts as a basis for investigation and debate back towards understanding the unity from which the manifest world derives. And I discussed these incredible resonances between Dzogchen and David Bohm in my latest book, the Tibetan Book of the Undivided Universe. I've gone deeply into Dzogchen texts and compared them to all of David Bohm's works, as well as his works with Basil Hiley, to show the incredible resonances. Here's another quote from David Bohm. Again, this is from Wholeness and the Implicate Order. It is being suggested here, then, that what we perceive through the senses as empty space is actually the plenum, which is the ground for the existence of everything, including ourselves. The things that appear to our senses are derivative forms, and their true meaning can be seen only when we consider the plenum in which they are generated and sustained, and into which they must ultimately vanish. The plenum is, however, no longer to be conceived through the idea of simple material medium, such as an ether. Rather, one is to begin with the holo movement, in which there is an immense sea of energy. This idea is to be understood in terms of a multidimensional implicate order. While the entire universe of matter, as we generally observe it, is to be treated as a comparatively small pattern of excitation, This excitation pattern is relatively autonomous and gives rise to approximately recurrent, stable and separable projections into a three-dimensional explicate order of manifestation, which is more or less equivalent to that of space as we commonly perceive it. So here again we find David Bohm, quantum physicist, clearly developing the idea that the quantum field is a field of potentiality from which consciousness and the material world, or the appearance of the material world, ultimately derives. But in itself, it is a movement, or hollow movement, of immaterial energy. And furthermore, Bohm clearly states that he considers this fundamental field of energy, the hollow movement, is mind-like rather than matter-like. What appears as matter is actually just that, appearances, flashes of momentary apparent existence within the moving of the fundamental field, which again, Bohm quite clearly states, is mind-like, as an internal nature of consciousness. Here Bohm says, it is thus implied that in some sense a rudimentary mind-like quality is present even at the level of particle physics, and that as we go to deeper levels, or subtler levels, this mind-like quality becomes stronger and more developed. Now, this doesn't mean that Bohm actually thinks that electrons, go to bed at night, wake up in the morning, have thoughts like you and I. Such ideas are ridiculous, but I mean such ideas are actually being projected into what's been called panpsychism. Bohm is suggesting that there is a kind of non-individuated internal mind-like quality which is primary within quantum fields of the hollow movement. And in this observation, Bohm comes exceedingly close to defining the quantum field as what Dzogchen calls mind nature. Again, this is from the Dzogchen Bon text, Unbounded Wholeness. Being wholly uncontrived, mind nature neither improves upon enlightenment nor becomes flawed in samsara. Always present in all beings, it is the abiding condition itself, otherwise described as unbounded wholeness. So mind nature is the fundamental energy source of the entire process of reality, which David Bohm calls the hollow movement. This is a quote from another book of Dzogchen philosophy. This term it comes from this book by Herbert V. Gunther, fantastic Dzogchen philosopher. From Reductionism to Creativity, Dzogchen and the New Sciences of Mind. It is this inner dynamics of being that eventually pushes it, figuratively speaking, over the instability threshold into its actuality, so that the virtually operative actuality in being now assumes a true actuality that may be called being's eigenstate. This process is termed Zinang. It's a Tibetan term. Which, borrowing a term coined by David Bohm, I render as hollow movement, which in Dzogchen context means that being in its totality lights up, and in this lighting up makes its presence felt. The implication is that, as paradoxical as it may sound, being is nowhere else than in the what is. This means that we are the whole and yet only part of it. And Gunther saw immediately the resonance between David Bohm's work and Dzogchen philosophy. And it is extraordinary. I mean, here he's talking about being in its unmanifest state has this internal cognizant pressure, so to speak, to unfold its manifestation into actualized being, and that breaks through the unity to produce the hollow moving world of manifestation of embodied consciousness and the appearance of the material world. These ideas are completely fundamental to Dzogchen, and they are reiterated in the work of the later work of the quantum physicist David Bohm.
Related consciousness is an internal relationship to the whole. We take in the whole and we act toward the whole. And that internal, whatever we have taken in, determines basically what we are. We hold to our own opinion.
This wholeness, this new consciousness, this wholeness, is that something that you can only glimpse? Perhaps in, like, as you might have a glimpse of heaven, or is it something scientific? I mean, can you think your way through it?
It can be given a scientific realization, you see. Because of relativity and quantum theory, we can, if we wish, look on the world as a whole. Consciousness is really our most immediate experience of this implicate order.
We can comprehend that aspect of atomism which still provides a correct and valid form of insight, i.e. that in spite of the undivided wholeness in flowing movement, the various patterns that can be abstracted from it have a certain relative autonomy and stability, which is indeed provided for by the universal law of the flowing movement. And Bohm was not the only physicist to think in these kind of terms. I mean, when we look at the work of Werner, here's his book, Veiled Reality. And the point that is relevant to the here considered issue is that it succeeds in doing so by making primary some concepts of a general nature, such as fields associated with types of particles, and secondary, the concept of individualized particles. Consequently, if we are on the lookout for some concept or mathematical algorithm that in this theory could be identified as referring to the basic stuff, we can find none. except conceivably the element, the state of which changes when a particle gets created or annihilated. Which means that, conceptually speaking, the theory is as far from atomism as is conceivably possible for a theory to be. Hence, to repeat, there is to say the least, a considerable mismatch between atomism as defined above and conventional quantum field theory. And in his book on physics and philosophy, Werner tells us that the doctrine that the world is made up of objects whose existence is independent of human consciousness turns out to be in conflict with quantum mechanics and with facts established by experiment. So here we have another quantum physicist, again highly qualified, very respected quantum physicist, coming to the conclusion that in some way consciousness and the appearance of what seems to be an external physical world are interconnected and interpenetrate in some way. And Despinay also indicates that it is possible that various mystical philosophies may have valid insights in this field of research and discourse. I mean, ideas like this will certainly get materialists, kind of foaming at the mouth, if not spitting blood. But there you go. This is what Werner Despinay says. He says that, in particular, Buddhist thought may be applicable because Buddhist thought, or at least Madhyamaka, rejects the notion of a ground of things and even lays stress on the opposite notion, the one of an absence of foundation or emptiness. Now, in fact, Madhyamaka points to the insubstantiality of what you might think to be a ground of the process of reality. It does not indicate a complete absence, but Western philosophers often get Madhyamaka wrong in this respect. In passing, we might point out that more recently, two authors, both physicists again, Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuchner, wrote a controversial book called Quantum Enigma, Physics Encounters Consciousness, in which they state there is no way to interpret quantum theory without in some way addressing consciousness. Now, although Despinay talks about interpenetration of consciousness and what appears to be a material world, he also makes one very important observation, that he is not suggesting that human beings wander around beaming beams of intentional rays of consciousness in order to create a material world according to their whims, which is the kind of idea that some New Age writers, YouTubers would tend to suggest, read this book, clear your mind, create your own reality. No. The situation is far more subtle than that. So Despondet writes in Veiled Reality, we sometimes build up quite beautifully rational theories that experiments falsify. Something says no. This something cannot be just us. There must therefore be something else than just us. There's also some kind of objective pushback. We can't determine what the material world is going to be just because we would like it to be a certain way, which again is the kind of New Age version of quantum mysticism, so to speak. And David Bohm makes a similar point in his book Causality and Chance in Modern Physics, where he writes, we may then ask the question, does the fact that any given theory can only be approximately, conditionally, and relatively true mean that there is no objective reality? To see that this is not so, it is only necessary to ask the further question whether the behavior of things is arbitrary. For example, would it be possible for us to choose the natural laws holding within a given degree of approximation and a particular set of conditions at will, in accordance with our tastes, or what we feel would be helpful for us in the solution of various kinds of practical problems? The fact that we cannot actually do this shows that these laws have an objective content, in the sense that they represent some kind of necessity that is independent of our wills and of the way we think about things. So you see, people who want to co-opt physicists such as David Bohm into a fully fledged New Age agenda are entirely misguided. And recently, I won't go into details here, there's an example of a internet forum and movement which is basically misrepresenting the ideas of David Bohm as if he meant the world can be whatever we want it to be, just think the right thoughts and wow, everything will be wonderful. The world is infinitely malleable. This is not at all what quantum physics says, and it's not what David Bohm ever said. As I've said, things are a little more subtle than that. It may be the case that consciousness unfolds quantum potentialities into the world of the seeming material environment with sentient beings with internal consciousness occupying the apparently material world. But the point is, the nature of the potentialities determine what are possibilities, and the fact, as we shall see, that the entire process is unravelled by primordial consciousness, not by individual beings wandering around collapsing quantum potentialities, to take, conform to their whims of the moment. It's a much deeper source of universal consciousness which creates both sentient beings and the material world. Now, sentient beings are part of that process, and when certain quantum experiments are carried out, it may appear that their individuated consciousness is producing flashes of existence within double-slit experiments and so on, but this is a misinterpretation. It is primordial consciousness. Generally speaking, when people think about and claim that consciousness in some sense produces the material world, in some sense, it is always assumed that the claim is that individual sentient beings wander around creating reality on a whim. Or at least, if not on a whim, but they individually somehow create the material world. Even when it is asserted that it is a collective illusion, it is difficult to get past the idea that somehow conscious intentionality is involved, wherein this is not the case. But if we look, for instance, at Roger Penrose, he rules out the idea that consciousness is involved in the functioning of the manifestation of reality from quantum potentiality, purely because this is the way he understands the situation. And he writes, "It seems to me, however, that any theory that demands the presence of a conscious observer leads to a very lopsided and implausible picture of the universe. Imagine some distant Earth-like planet without conscious life, and for which there is no consciousness for many, many light years in all directions. What is the weather like on this planet? The absence of consciousness, according to the particular version he's considering, consciousness collapses wave functions, would mean that the reduction of the wave function never occurs on such a planet. So such a planet would have no weather. But if one understands that we're talking about a deep level of primordial consciousness functioning throughout the universe, which only becomes manifest in certain places where sentient beings somehow arise on planets which have conducive environments, it does not mean that primordial consciousness is not functioning at deep levels throughout the universe. So Roger Penrose's refutation is entirely misplaced, mistargeted. It demolishes a very kind of superficial notion of consciousness creating reality, but not the idea that primordial consciousness may be responsible. And Penrose points out that just about almost all the conventional interpretations of quantum mechanics ultimately depend on the presence of a perceiving being. But he rules it out because there are no perceiving beings roaming about Jupiter, for example, in order to create the weather on Jupiter. But if primordial consciousness does the job, which is pretty much the view of someone like David Bohm or Bernard Despinay. This is a presentation of Despinay's veiled reality viewpoint, where there is an underlying reality which is neither matter nor mind, but an immaterial field capable of producing both, which gives rise to material world and individuated consciousness. According to Despinay, consciousness is somehow set adrift, as it were, and there is a veil between individuated consciousness and the quantum ground underlying. So Bernard Despinay writes in his chapter The Ground of Things in his book on physics and philosophy, and he says here, for the effective state of mind Einstein attributed to Planck, and which he himself undoubtedly experienced, to be justified, it is in no way necessary that Pythagoreanism be 100% true, that the real be totally intelligible by means of mathematics. It is quite sufficient that the great idea should appear valid, of the existence of a real towards the hidden structures and qualities of which human mind may tend with wonder, while remaining aware that it will never attain them due to the simple fact that understanding them would exceed its ability. Now, there are two important points here which I will go into in a different talk. The fact that the nature of consciousness guarantees the truth of mathematics, because consciousness has its own internal recognition of coherence. This is not to say that it cannot go wrong, but there are ways of rectifying the insights of consciousness when they do go wrong. Well, we can go into this at a later stage. But mathematics is not, the reason mathematics works is because it is a direct perception of coherent structures by the nature of consciousness. Bits of random matter banging around would never give rise to mathematics as we. And we should say more, for, upon reflection, this idea clearly is even more consonant with the third level religious experience dear to Einstein than is one of a real assumed to be wholly knowable, i.e. a transcendent experience of some kind. It fits to the best with what appears to be an obscure but great truth, to wit, that human mind is first of all oriented towards expectation and quest. I mean, it is a mind whose nature is to tend with confidence and perseverance towards something that it will never reach, and that therefore, same as a horizon, partakes of transcendence. True, throughout his life, work and writings, Einstein had already shown us that even facing a classical science stamped with physical realism, some religiosity, some sense of the divine remains possible. But such divine still was of a mathematically limpid nature. and therefore quasi-incommensurable with mankind. Thanks to the very fact that it forces us to overstep this realism, contemporary physics shows that it is sensible, nay, we might almost say rational, to proceed a little further. For as we saw, it bars reducing being to material components. Let me read that again. Quantum physics, contemporary physics, bars reducing being to material components, and thereby makes it impossible to believe consciousness to be a product of matter. Makes it impossible to believe consciousness to be just a product of matter, that is, of empirical reality. Hence the idea that being is somehow prior to the mind-matter splitting becomes defensible even in front of a scientific audience. Thus this picture which shows mind and matter deriving from a deeper, more common source was exactly the view of David Bohm and quite a few other modern quantum physicists. There's a lot to say about this stuff. I mean, this picture is taken from this essay on science and Hinduism, which is about Advaita Vedanta. But as you can see, this is looking into purely the relationship between the views of Bernard Despinay and Advaita Vedanta. There is just so much to go into and so much detail which is missed. I don't think, I mean, please, if I'm mistaken here and you know of other YouTube channels which goes into these kind of ideas in the depth that I do, please let me know. I know of none. And I'm only just starting. There's an interesting point here that Jonathan Duquette, probably mispronouncing his name, many apologies, points out that quantum theory, as again several quantum physicists have indicated, the connection between modern discoveries and Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, Advaita being non-duality, because the ground, quantum ground, is non-dual. It gives rise to mind and matter. One of the early people to write about this was a Hindu monk and philosopher, Vivekananda, who was around, who wrote at the end of the 19th century. And apparently he wrote, "It seems to us and to all who care to know that the conclusions of modern science are the very conclusions the Vedanta reached ages ago. Only in modern science they are written in the language of matter." This is a very important observation. I only just came across it this morning. I was shocked. It seems to us, and to all who care to know that the conclusions of modern science are the very conclusions the Vedanta reached ages ago. Only in modern science they are written in the language of matter. And this is entirely correct. Earlier in the talk I mentioned this book by Brian Greene, Until the End of Time. It's a primary example of an author who presents the findings of modern physics, modern science in general. And it's a good read. I'm not, when I said this was smoke and mirrors, doesn't mean it's not a good book to read. When I said it's smoke and mirrors, it presents a intricate, stunning view of the modern understanding of the universe, which only really makes sense from the point of view of David Bohm or Bernard Despinay, that the whole process, or what Bohm called the hollow movement, derives from a deeper fundamental source with a mind-like internal nature, but it's written through word deception in a way to imply that mind is just a kind of illusory piece of nonsense. And matter is everything that matters, so to speak. And it shows you that even modern physicists with materialist bent, they quite happily resort to insults. I mean, here's a chapter, Particles and Consciousness. Everything begins with consciousness, and nothing is worth anything except through it, is how Albert Camus put it. Yet until recent years, consciousness was an unwelcome word in the hard sciences. Sure, doddering researchers in the twilight of their careers might be forgiven for turning to the fringe topic of mind. But the goal of mainstream scientific research is an understanding of objective reality. And for many, and for a long time, consciousness did not qualify. Some years ago, during a good-natured but heated exchange on the role of mathematics describing the universe, I emphatically told a late-night television host that he was nothing but a bag of particles gathered by the laws of physics. In what follows, we will discuss upheavals that some consciousness researchers envisage to be heading our way. But for reasons that will become clear, I suspect that consciousness is less mysterious than it feels, and so he's a materialist. And in the final pages of Green's book, we read that as we hurtle towards a cold and barren cosmos, we must accept that there is no grand design. Better tell Molodino that, because he wrote a book with Hawking called The Grand Design. Particles are not designed. Particles are not endowed with purpose. There is no final answer hovering in the depths of space awaiting discovery. Special collections of particles can think and feel and reflect. And within these subjective worlds, they can create purpose. And again, this is what I mean by smoke and mirrors and deception. If there is no purpose, particles cannot create purpose. See, they will say, things don't exist over here, but magically they do exist over here. But when you analyse what they're actually saying, they don't exist. What is being said here is particles are fooling you into thinking that purpose exists. But the entire project of this materialistic demolition of the reality of mind and purpose, at the same time as pretending mind and purpose in the end do kind of exist in an insignificant way. But it is significant, but it's insignificant. I mean, again, I'm trying to wake people up to realising this is just smoke and mirrors. Either there is purpose or there isn't. You can't say over here there's no purpose, but magically. Anyway, special collections of particles suddenly can think and feel. Wow! Dear. That is the noble direction to look. I be fooled. Science is a powerful, exquisite tool for grasping an external reality. Within that understanding, everything else is the human species contemplating itself. Grasping what it needs to carry on in a purposeless universe, of course, which magically we can pretend has a purpose, although Green has told us ultimately it doesn't have a purpose. We tell a story that reverberates into the darkness. A story carved of sound and etched into silence. A story at its best, which is not a very good best, of course, but it's making an effort here. Brian Greene is. Stirs the soul. Brian, there is no soul. According to your book, souls don't exist. Just think I should tell you this. Smoke and mirrors. I mean, this is classic and paradigmatic smoke and mirrors, materialist bullshitting. But it's a good book, and you see, when you analyse this book very carefully, and it is a good book, once you've analysed it and got rid of all the materialist nonsense and Green's dogmatic materialist programming. Once one's done that, one realises the story that Brian Greene tells in this book is far more consistent with the view put forward by the Lankavatara Sutra, which is an exposition of the mind-only view of reality, which is basically all the phenomena of the appearance of matter and mind results from an infinite potentiality of mind nature, of mind energy, not of mindless matter. Mind energy, giving appearances of matter and producing short-lived or sentient beings who have glimmers of individuated consciousness, which are mere what we can say, flickers of the infinite potentiality of the mind, the cosmic mind, which is fundamental to the entire process. The sense minds and their centralized discriminating mind are related to the external world, which is a manifestation of itself and is given over to perceiving, discriminating, and grasping its mare-like appearances. Mare means illusion. Universal mind, Aleo Vijnana, transcends all individuation and limits. Universal mind is thoroughly pure in its essential nature, subsisting unchanged and free from the faults of impermanence, undisturbed by egoism, unruffled by distinctions, desires and aversions. Universal mind is like a great ocean. Its surface, ruffled by waves and surges, but its depths remaining forever unmoved. In itself it is devoid of personality and all that belongs to it. But by reason of the defilement upon its face, it is like an actor and plays a variety of parts, among which a mutual functioning takes place, and the mind system arises. And in my next video, I shall show you how the descriptions, the stories told in Brian Greene's book makes far more sense from a quantum mind-only perspective. See, here again, Brian Greene asserts that the scientific journey we've taken suggests strongly that the universe does not exist to provide an arena for life and mind to flourish. That's not true. His own book, when you take away the materialistic programming, the dogmatic predisposition to materialist viewpoint that Greene clearly embodies, when you take that away, the opposite is the case. As another physicist, Paul Davies, clearly states, the evidence is that life and mind is clearly written into the quantum ground.
How do you view consciousness in terms of understanding reality? Is it something significant or trivial?
I've always thought that consciousness is something significant, indeed very significant in the evolution of the universe. And although we see consciousness only in a very small subset of physical systems, and nevertheless it seems to me to play an absolutely fundamental role. Part of life has consciousness. Is it just a little embellishment on the great scheme of things, or does it play a fundamental role? Now, I think it plays a fundamental role for all sorts of reasons.
Does the fact that that consciousness somehow have an effect at the quantum level, which is generally recognized, does that have meaning or just metaphor for the entirety of reality?
Physicists are sharply split on whether consciousness really matters when it comes to quantum physics. And I've oscillated throughout my career. I used to think, well, it's just getting in the way of understanding. But because I'm convinced that consciousness is a fundamental part of the universe, and I should say that my main reason is not physical, it's philosophical. It's because human beings are much more than observers. We also understand the universe through science and mathematics. So it seems to be much more than just observing the universe. So therefore I think it's significant. But because I think it's significant, I'd like to find a place for it in physics. And the one place that it has sort of been on again, off again, is within the realm of quantum physics.
A view also held by people like David Bohm, Despinay, Michael Mensky, Henry Stapp. The only reason Green can come to this conclusion is it's a conclusion he wants to come to. It's not there in the evidence. Rather, the evidence suggests that the Zen patriarch, Hung Po, was more correct when he asserted that this pure mind, the source of everything, shines forever and all with its brilliance of its own perfection. But the people of the world do not awake to it, regarding only that which sees, hears, feels and knows as mind. Blinded by their own sight, hearing, feeling and knowing, they do not perceive the spiritual brilliance of the source substance. If they would only eliminate all conceptual thought in a flash, that source substance would manifest itself like the sun ascending through the void and illuminating the whole universe without hindrance or bounds. In this book, Bonpo Dzogchen Teachings, by Lopon Tenzin Namdak, we read as follows. Modern science has always been searching for the ultimate particles, but has never found them. Why? Because there is no limit. When we follow after thoughts, they lead us on endlessly. We never come to an ultimate source, or ultimate particle, or absolute beginning. We are looking in the wrong place. This is just circulating in samsara. All states of consciousness are conditioned. They are created by our thoughts. But these same thoughts liberate themselves and leave no trace. What is their source? Where do they go? They arise in the natural state and they dissolve again into the natural state. The natural state is empty, but on the other hand, it has the potentiality for all manifestation to arise. It is the nature of mind. And as such, it is like a mirror which has the capacity to reflect whatever is set before it. And this book describes the ultimate experience of non-dual mind as the glow of the ground of being. In other words, when one becomes able to still thoughts and move one's centre of operations within one's own mind, so to speak, to the deepest level possible, you will experience the glow of the ground of being, which is probably why he's so happy, I assume. I just saw a clip from Paul Davies. Now, Paul Davies, in his book, The Goldilocks Enigma, writes as follows: a good case can be made that life and mind are fundamental physical phenomena, and so must be incorporated into the overall cosmic scheme. One possible line of evidence for the central role of mind comes from the way in which an act of observation enters into quantum mechanics. It turns out that the observation process conceals a subtle form of teleology. So, Paul Davies is pointing out here that the natural energetic ground nature source for the infinite phenomena of the manifested world contains within it its own manifesting process, which involves an internal self-perception process which unfolds potentialities. And one might ask, well, why would this happen? And the answer is given. In the unmanifested state, the ground level non-dual mind nature is unaware of its own qualities, so to speak. It is only through manifestation and then exploration of its own nature that its hidden qualities actually may be experienced. And ultimately, when individual minds merge again into the non-dual nature, they realize the ultimate experience. Thus, we read, this is from a Dzogchen book by Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, Wonders of the Natural Mind. And this is about what actually happens when a sentient being understands emptiness, the ultimate nature. Who then understands emptiness? There is a self-understanding of emptiness by emptiness itself, by the clarity aspect of emptiness that enables understanding by direct perception. Understanding is not separate from emptiness. Emptiness understands itself and illuminates itself, as in the examples of the butter lamp. The fact that a butter lamp illuminates itself as well as all other phenomena around it. Herein lies the inseparability of emptiness and clarity. Self-understanding is self-clarity or self-awareness. And one has to actually take one's hat off to Paul Davis's suggestion that the process of reality is a self-creating, self-explaining, self-understanding universe with observers involving teleology. And the teleology, the purpose, is the unfolding of potentialities so that mind nature can know and explore its own qualities. So, and according to Buddhism and other spiritual traditions of the East, it is possible to experience the non-dual ground, the source substance, in deep meditational states. Indeed, not only this, but at a certain point of practice, when you emerge from these states of deep meditation, you're aware of the source substance in your everyday life, and that is called enlightenment. When you move through the world, seeing without conceptual overlay, but just seeing into its true nature of being a holographic illusion generated by primordial mind, as far as I can tell, having researched this stuff in quite a lot of detail, that is what enlightenment means. And it's a perfectly doable state. But it requires a bit more than reading, a few New Age books. I mean, if you want to do it, I guess you've got to, I haven't done it, but I guess you really do have to go and do some serious meditation retreats, As I say, great Buddhist meditators retreated to caves for years. But it's possible to get a much lower level understanding by doing some serious meditation. And as I say, jhanas is an approach. Anyway, I think that is enough. Again, this video has been longer than I originally intended, but as I've said in other videos, exploring these ideas really takes a bit longer than a 15-20 minute, video thrown together on the spur of the moment, before one's second cup of coffee in the morning. This one's taken a week. Anyway, probably I'll do my next one in another week. Thanks for now.